from a design point of view, one of the more important pavilions at the fair, aside from Sullivan's Transportation Building, are these three cute little buildings. These are the Japanese Pavilion. The Japanese, just 30 years, had opened Japan to the West, as I had mentioned before. And by this time in the French fair and in the English fairs and here in the United States, the Japanese were invited and brought over in parts these typical houses to show off Japan. These were absolutely fascinating to a variety of architects, but in particular Green and Green, who stopped at this fair, and I'm going to talk about Green and Green, who are the founders of arts and crafts in the West in California. Also very interested in Sullivan, and Frank Lloyd Wright was fascinated by these buildings, because keep in mind, it's kind of extraordinary, but there had been no exposure to Japanese culture in the West before 1867. And so here they are. Anyway, it was important to some people. To some other people, it made not the slightest difference, and they were not particularly interested. So I'm going to show you a little bit about Burnham's work after the fair. And the most famous building of his is undoubtedly this one. It's our landmark Flatiron. Burnham was not a particularly gifted engineer, a particularly gifted architect aesthetically. This is sort of a Beaux-Arts tower, and I'll show you why I say he wasn't particularly gifted. This is his building in New York, which we all know and have quite a lot of affection for. This is his building in Chicago, which is almost identical. The cornice is practically the same. This two-story crown is very similar. The rounded windows on the corner are almost the same. The two-story loggia at the bottom, there's a great deal of similarity. So he wasn't strikingly creative, but he got a lot of work. This is one of his projects later on. And this is another one that many of you may have been through. So the Beaux-Arts idiom is, I'm not trying to say that it's bad. I'm not trying to say that it's there's something wrong with it. It's just not really part of the progressive modernist movement. However, this is a very useful railroad station. It still is today. It's well planned and has high roofs. And it's a beautiful place to come in by train. So there's no, I just don't want you to think that I'm dissing Beaux-Arts. It's just that it's not really on the road to modernism. Here's another Beaux-Arts building that we all know, and hopefully you know it. It's the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Richard Morris Hunt, who was also one of the designers at the Chicago World's Fair. Now I want to point out something to you that a taxi driver showed me 3 years ago. He pulled up in front of the museum. I hailed a cab in front of the museum. And we were sitting at the light, and we were already chatting. And he turned to me and he said, "Did you ever notice those things on top of the columns?" He said, "Did you ever notice these?" I said, "No." These are supposed to be sculptures. When you make a sculpture out of limestone, first you pile up a bunch of limestone blocks, and then you stand up there on the scaffold and you get your chisel and your hammer and you carve a lion, or you carve some naked babes, or you naked men or something, but that's how you make a large, massive sculpture on a large, massive building. None of them have ever been carved. And now it's too late. You can only carve marble, and you can only carve limestone when they are freshly quarried. So when Michelangelo carved his sculptures, he insisted that the blocks that came out of the quarries at Carrara have dates on them, carved on them, so that he knew when they came out of the mountain. Because once stone, marble, or limestone oxidize a certain amount, once they're out in the air, they get harder and harder because the crystalline structure changes. That's a little fact for you to know. But isn't that fun? Now you can point that out. And it means you should always talk to your taxi driver. The last kind of Beaux-Arts silliness, glory, silly gloriness, shall we say, is this delight. And it really is a delight. This was also part of a World's Fair in San Francisco in 1915. And it's essentially the last kind of Beaux-Arts gesture in the United States. This is a close-up of it. It's all kind of it's an open-air pavilion, and it's the only thing that's left from the San Francisco World's Fair. Designed by this man named Bernard Maybeck, who I'm going to spend practically a whole lecture on in a couple of weeks from now, it's the only Beaux-Arts project he ever did in his career. And it's kind of an anomaly, and a very amusing anomaly, and it's much beloved by San Franciscans, and it's basically part of a public park down on the Presidio. So the design trend lasted a little longer. This Beaux-Arts design trend lasted a little longer than the Art Nouveau movement, but World War I essentially brought the Beaux-Arts movement to a close. The prominent practitioners died before that war, including Burnham, including Richard Morris Hunt, and a man named George Post. And also, interestingly, the professors of architecture, the people who taught at places like MIT, were all imports when they first opened architecture schools. That is Columbia, MIT, Yale. Those were the first three schools to open architecture schools in this country. They all imported their professors from France, many of whom spoke not a word of English. Some of the courses were conducted in French in the early years. The fact is, those professors by the First World War were beginning to retire or die. And a new crop of design teachers were coming into those schools who were not French but American, and who were schooled in American progressive design. So Beaux-Arts really dies out for a couple of reasons, but that's one of them. The third path that I want to mention tonight, the third path, you're all familiar with, and based on reports I've had, entirely sick of hearing about Frank Lloyd Wright, but I'm sorry, we can't do a course on modernism without my mentioning Mr. Wright a couple of times. This is his first important house project. It's still there in River Forest, right near Chicago. I really don't know how these people who live in this house stand it, because there's constantly architecture students on the front lawn, including myself in 1977 when I took this photograph. And not only was I on the front lawn, but as you can see, I was standing just pretty much right in front of the front door. And there were a couple of other architecture students kind of milling around the lawn. I love this photograph. I was very into sepia photography at the time, and I was printing my own photographs, and so there you have it. There's something interesting about this house, and I want to compare it to a house that was designed in Chicago shortly before this, which is I've shown before, called the Charnley Persky House. This is an Adler and Sullivan, that is Louis Sullivan and his partner. But Frank Lloyd Wright was working for them at the time of this house design. And it's assumed that Wright had rather a considerable amount autonomy in designing this house. So if you look at the Charnley Persky house, and if you look at the Winslow house, which is Wright's, this is the Winslow house, and it's Wright's, essentially what he credits as his first important house. Look at the front door, if you will, the front door that I had just photographed in 1977, and notice that you have these two dominant windows here embracing the front door. The front door is shorter in both of these houses. Here are these dominant windows, and then the front doors pulled down a little. Notice the two strong flanking windows here. Notice here they are again. There's a powerful horizontal band here, and there's a powerful horizontal band on the Charnley Persky house. This is a decorative incised terracotta on the Charnley. That's the detail of the incised terracotta. On the Charnley Persky house, there's a similar incised wood. So there's a connection there that I was trying to point out. This is the front of the Winslow house. In the back, he's playing with some breakout ideas. A curved dining room that's curved here. A stair tower going up. This open loggia, this open loggia in the back. These are interior photographs. The round dining room and the entry foyer and the plan, which I won't really go into because we're out of time, just to say you may be sick of Frank Lloyd Wright, but the fact is his plan was always a powerful part of what he succeeded in doing. The other important thing about Frank Lloyd Wright to know, and her name is going to come up on a test, so I want you to know it. Her name is Marion Mahoney. She is his chief renderer, drawer. She was also an architect, and a very good one, but she was a brilliant, brilliant renderer. And after she was hired, she did almost all of the renderings in the office, though she was never credited with it, but that's no surprise. Marion Mahoney then went on in 1915 with her husband, Walter Burley. They moved to Australia, of all places, and designed the entire town of Canberra. Just a useful little fact, because she was really sick to death of Frank Lloyd Wright. But much of his early success, honestly, is due to the extraordinary graphic quality of her renderings. And I want to show you the plan for this house. One of the reasons people are maybe a little uncomfortable with Frank Lloyd Wright is that the man is a fascist, in the best sense of the word. But we know this, he likes to control everything. He likes to control how you enter. He likes to control the procession through the house. And once you are in the house, he likes to control how and where you sit or stand or read or look out the window. So the entrance here is through a long path from the driveway. You can't see the door here, but you enter on a lower level and you come up these stairs. And then this is quite a dark space. And you come up the stairs and it gets lighter and lighter as you go towards the public spaces in the house, which is this astonishing dining room and living room, and then of course the porch at that end. So there's a progression, and then if you are a part of the household, then you can go off into your study, or you can go off into the upstairs bedrooms. But there's definitely a kind of a control of progression, and this happens over and over with Wright's work. So, and when I say he's a fascist, in the best sense of the word, these chairs are a great example. These have to be the most uncomfortable dining chairs ever. You sit up straight at dinner, or you don't come to dinner. These are really heavy. The table is the table is extremely heavy, but the chairs are really heavy. And, my head on these chairs might come to here. I think you feel a little bit, less than significant. You certainly don't put your elbows on the table, and you don't speak rudely to your spouse across that table, I don't think. So that's Mr. Wright. he did influence an entire style that's very prevalent in the Midwest. We don't see it much here, but the prairie style is very important in the Midwest, and it still continues to this day. And these are a couple of exemplars of the prairie style. And you're going to get a lecture in 2 weeks from a very good friend of mine who's a woman, who's an architectural historian and a furniture expert and an expert on the prairie style. And she's going to talk about these two individuals, William Purcell and George Elmsley, who are much less well known, but equally important. And we end where we started with the Seagram building. And I thank you very much for your patience.